LGBT forces are pushing ahead with efforts to pass the Equality Act as they celebrate a landmark Supreme Court ruling that says existing federal law prohibits job discrimination on the basis of what the left calls sexual orientation or transgender status. The High Court's 6-3 decision is expected to have monumental ramifications beyond employment discrimination law. But during an election year, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Human Rights Campaign are calling for Senate approval of the House-passed Equality Act. The measure, they and other proponents contend, would extend federal protection in public accommodations, housing, and medical care. And if he's elected president, Democrat Joe Biden says it will be the first thing he gets done. Dr. Robert Gagnon is one of the most authoritative voices in America in making the case against the Equality Act. He explained his opposition to the bill during the recent Illinois Family Institute Worldview Conference at the Village Church of Barrington, where he also implored pastors to preach on the importance of sexual purity.
Now, just with regard to the so-called Equality Act, which the Democrats made first priority business when they gained control of the House, and for which there is already 46 co-sponsors, in addition to the sponsor, that makes 47 in the Senate. That's how close it already is in the Senate. Okay? And so we need every bulwark to prevent that from getting passed. Why? What's so problematic about the Equality Act, which I think is better worded as Get the Homophobic and Transphobic Bigot Act? That's you. Right off the get-go with regard to that bill is it says you cannot use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to get out of this. Okay? The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is basically gutted. And this puts in civil rights categories sexual orientation and gender identity. You know what gender identity is, right? That's the euphemism for transgenderism. Here's some of the things that would happen as a result of that bill getting passed. First of all, it would put men who claim a female gender identity in every woman's restroom, locker room, and dressing room in the nation. Every woman's shelter, every woman's prison, every woman's sports. And you will not be able to stop it. It will lead to a national mandatory indoctrination by all the public schools and non-religious private schools into the LGBTQ radical agenda. That includes mandatory drag queen story hours for the very youngest of children in schooling. That includes mandatory assemblies and classroom instruction that rail against hateful, ignorant bigots like yourself. It will be used to promote homosexual practice and transgender identity at the very earliest ages. No teacher or administrator will be able to stop a boy from entering a girl's bathroom for fear that in doing so, that boy might identify as a girl. Because this bill does not require for transgenderism that there be any outward change in the person's appearance. It will result in national mandatory speech laws. In New York, we already have such laws with regard to transgenderism that will fine a person who, quote, misgenders a transgender person with up to $250,000 in fines. It will punish all persons who own a small business with massive fines and threat of imprisonment who do not want to be forced to use their talents to promote actively and directly homosexual intercourse and transgenderism. It will give the federal government the power to withhold money from any state that does not rigorously promote that agenda. It will lead to the removal of federal funding and ultimately accreditation from every religious school and college that does not promote sexual orientation and gender identity differences. And you know what that happens if a religious school, a religious college or university loses ultimately not only the research funds for science stuff or federal funding for student loans, but also ultimately loses accreditation. What do you think is going to happen to that school? It goes belly up. In other words, this bill would effectively destroy Christian education in the United States. And yet we actually have Christian educators in schools, including in places like Wheaton, that think that the worst thing that could face us is to have Donald Trump reelected. And I'm thinking, you even realize you're going to end up losing your job? I know what it is to lose a job. It's not a pretty thing, not a happy story. It will give the state the power to remove your own children from your own home and prosecute you for child abuse if you do not affirm your child's transgender wishes to be called by the name or pronouns at odds with their biological sex. Can you imagine the state taking your children out of your home? It will ban any sexual orientation change therapy, or indeed any attempt to deter people from engaging in homosexual practice or transgender change. It will force all businesses and public universities to implement sexual orientation and gender identity affirmative action hiring programs. It's not just enough to give equal grounds. Affirmative action hiring, it's actually a plus. Right now, in the Ivy League schools, it's a plus for your application if you identify as LGBTQ. It's not even won't do you harm, it will actually do you good to put that in. Employees will be required to report to human resources, any employees who are overheard speaking negatively, fellow employees as well, who are overheard speaking negatively about gay marriage, homosexuality, or transgenderism. You will be reported to HR and dealt with accordingly. Even if you only post on social media outside of the workplace, you will be so reported for creating an unsafe environment in the workplace. It will force doctors and nurses, even at Catholic hospitals, to perform, quote, sex reassignment surgery, even to minors. It will force health professionals who attempt to warn youth and adults about the damaging effect of puberty blockers or transgender surgeries will be fired. It will put churches in jeopardy of losing their tax-exempt status. See Beto O'Rourke for that. By the way, in that Democratic primary where he said that any church that does not promote homosexual practice and transgenderism should lose its tax-exempt status, no other Democrat contender rebuked him. They just don't have the guts to say what they want to do because they still feel they need to get elected. Beto found out you can't get elected and say that view overtly. They just hold it secretly at this particular point in time. And they will make church buildings accessible for functions promoting homosexuality and transgenderism, including gay marriage, if you allow your building to be used for anything other than strictly church purposes. It will require all charities and adoption agencies not to practice sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in their hiring and in their distribution of services. It will compel law enforcement agencies, courts, and medical research studies to categorize transgender persons by their pretend sex. It will exclude from all political, corporate, academic, professional, and judicial hiring and appointments. Have I given enough elements there? Anyone who is not a cheerleader for all things gay and transgender. Commitment to treat people equally in the performance of one's duties will not be enough. One must declare unequivocal support for the LGBTQ agenda and reject any association with and any donations to any churches or parachurch organizations, schools, charities, clubs, and social outreach programs that do not support that agenda. If they find in your background that you did, even 10, 15 years ago, that will be grounds of not being hired or being fired. Now, there's more, but I think that's enough. And people tell me this is not the big issue that we now need to address in our voting. When you say that, you either don't know what you're talking about, or you yourself have come to a view about homosexual practice and transgenderism, which does not reflect the biblical viewpoint of the matter. These elements indicate cracks in the evangelical church. And they indicate a necessity on the part of pastors to preach regularly about the importance of sexual purity, because the last bulwark to educate people in the United States over these issues is the church. And if the church will not do it, then nobody will. I will grant you that you run a risk for doing so, but I will also tell you will never be a better time in the future than now to do it, because it will only get worse. So everybody, the old scriptural adage, metaphor, gird up your loins and prepare for battle. Thank you.
Dr. Robert Gagnon is professor of New Testament theology at Houston Baptist University. His book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, powerfully challenges attempts to identify love with affirmation of homosexual practice. With the Equality Act, abortion, and other key issues possibly to be determined by the outcome of the November election, it's important that you, as well as your family and friends who share your biblical values, are registered to vote. Click the Register to Vote button on the IllinoisFamily.org homepage. Click Register to Vote on the IllinoisFamily.org homepage.